Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Loving obeisances unto the Supreme Being Vasudeva, who is everything there is. Janmadyasya yato anvayaditaratascha artheshu abhignaswarat tene brahmahridaya adikavaye muhyanti yatsurayah tejo vari mridam yatha vinimayo yatratra sargo mrisha dhamna swena sada nirastakohakam satyam param dhimahi. We meditate upon the transcendent absolute being from whom springs forth this universe. He is present in all that exists and yet distinct from everything. He is fully conscious and totally independent. He revealed to the first seer Brahma the import of Vedic wisdom. The material creation, made of threefold gunas, appears in him as though real, like water in a mirage. Being eternally self effulgent, he is ever free of the illusion maya of the material world. We meditate upon him, the Supreme Being. Nigamakalpataror galitam phalam shukamukad amritadrava sanyutam pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavukaha. O devotees who relish a taste for divine love, Bhagavatam is the fully ripened fruit of the wish-yielding tree of Vedas, flowing as immortal nectar from Shuka Brahma Rishi. Go on drinking this sweet nectar day after day. We are now entering the 32nd chapter of the third Skandha of Srimad Bhagavatam. This is the concluding chapter of the teachings of Lord Kapila. So, in the last two chapters, Kapila gave a beautiful discourse on the power of dispassion by describing very forcefully the way of the one who is attached to the world, how he engages in acts which are abominable and disrespected by his own family, discarded, dies, goes through various species, born again as human, and yet if he doesn't recognize it and falls into the wrong association of people, repeats the same sins, the same ways of living, and gets caught in infatuation and desire and attachment and falls. And therefore, Lord Kapila, through this, gave a very dire warning that one can waste this precious gift of human existence in this way if one is not alert and careful. So one has to be very wise in having the right association, the right sangha, which is the foundation of spiritual life, which is how Lord Kapila started his teachings, that the spiritual association brings about jnana and bhakti. Now, Lord Kapila summarizes everything in this chapter very beautifully. First, he says that the one who is engaged in the duties of a householder and who is engaged in actions towards gaining wealth and pleasure, he turns his face away from the Lord. So, this person now is slightly different from the one who is attached to lust and greed and worldly pleasures. So, such people, as he already described in the chapters preceding, go through lot of suffering and fall into lower species, go through hellish existence, and they are always caught in that cycle of suffering until they come into the right association. Whereas even the one who may be having religious proclivities and yet he is engaged in religious actions only for living a good life here, engaged in accruing wealth, accruing pleasures, and acting according to religious principles, nevertheless, even he has turned his face away from the Lord because Lord Kapila says he is deluded by desire. And what he does is, in contrast to the one who was caught in attachment and lust and greed and therefore completely turned away from any spiritual way of living and therefore he falls into hellish existence. But this one, the one who is religiously minded, and yet his primary goal is to live a pleasurable life here and to propitiate his gods and his forefathers for that purpose. So he worships all the various deities and various forefathers. He engages in all the various karmas that are given by the scriptures. And yet, because his mind is swayed by reverence only for the various deities and various forefathers and not to the Supreme Lord, he attains a heavenly existence, but this heaven is also short lived. The contrast is instead of going through hellish existence because of this propensity towards religiosity and towards engaging in sacrificial performances, living according to the scriptural ordinances, even though he is not fully surrendered unto the Supreme Lord and he is worshipping various devatas, worshipping various deities and his forefathers, such a person, Lord Kapila says, he attains the realm of these devatas and the forefathers, which is considered to be the temporary heaven where he can enjoy some heavenly pleasures, and yet he also has to come back to be born among humans. So the only difference is he doesn't go through hellish existence before being born as human. He goes through a pleasurable existence, and yet he cannot avoid being born again into the womb of a mother and going through the suffering of being born into the world and going through the activities. So the cycle is different, and yet it leads him back to the same place. So unless he surrenders to the Supreme Lord, he goes through this cycle, which is still bringing him back to the human embryo and then through the suffering of human existence. Now, what Kapila says is, when Sri Hari, the Supreme Lord, at the end of every kalpa or at the end of every cycle, dissolves the universe, whatever activities whatever heavenly realms that this fellow has accrued, all get dissolved too. So if he is in the heavenly realm, he is absorbed, as it were, upon dissolution along with the heavenly realms, and upon the next cycle it comes forth along with such beings. So this is why we saw in the chapter on creation that upon each cycle of creation, the latent tendencies of the various jivas come out along with time. So these are such people who are engaged in various activities, some of which may even be religious, engaged in sacrifices, pleasing various deities and their forefathers. Such beings are again pushed back to the human womb in the cycle itself, and if it is at the end of the cycle, they are absorbed as these latent tendencies, and again upon the next cycle they come forth. In other words, there is no escaping the cycle of birth and death, regardless of whether it is in the middle of a cycle or even at the end of the whole kalpa, the cycle of creation, because even upon dissolution of the universe, such latent tendencies remain in the seed form and come forth as jivas in the next cycle until one surrenders completely and therefore is eternally situated as one with the Supreme Lord. So that's why Lord Kapila says the wise men, they don't go for either. They, of course, don't go for attachment to infatuation to worldly pleasures, which was warned against in the last two chapters, but they don't even fall for such worship of deities and devatas and various uh, practices engaging in propitiating the forefathers and all the rest. This is very commonly seen among many Orthodox people as well. They take care of all these kinds of karmas, but they do not surrender to the Supreme Being. And so the wise ones, Lord Kapila says, don't do that either. Instead, they never perform any duties for sensuous enjoyments or wealth. They only surrender all their actions unto me. They are free from all attachment. They are very serene and calm. Their mind is pure. They are devoted to duties which are only to remove attachment from the world. They have no feeling of I and mine, and they are endowed with a mind that is thoroughly clean and pure. And they are always engaged only in the sacred duty that is necessary to be done by surrendering everything unto me. So, this is the nature of the one, he says, who comes through the bright path that leads one to the Supreme Being. So the others are all dark paths, the darkest path being the one who is attached to infatuation, completely turned away from religion and going through hellish existence. And the shadowy path, it's called the path of the moon, is the one who is attached to heavenly beings and to forefathers and still comes back to be born as human. But the path of the light, the solar path as it were, the path of the sun, is the one that directly leads to the Supreme Being, which is the one who surrendered completely without any desire for either wealth or religious merit even. So Lord Kapila says, even the yogis who are engaged in meditation and who want supernatural powers, they may even attain as high as the abode of Brahma, what's called as Brahma Loka. But even such yogis and Brahma himself, they all are abiding in the Brahmaloka, and upon the next cycle they come forth again. Whereas the one who is fully surrendered unto me, he never comes back, he is always one with me. Therefore, he says, O great lady, he addresses his mother Devahuti, seek refuge in devotion alone to the one who has taken his abode in the lotus like heart of all living beings. He says nicely, Atha tam sarva bhutanam hrit padmeshu kritalayam. Hrit padmeshu means the lotus heart. Kritalayam, he has taken as his temple the lotus like heart of all living beings. And he says, Shrutanubhavam sharanam vraja bhavena bhamini. So you take sharanam, you take refuge in him who is situated in the lotus like heart of all beings and thereby free of all these various cycles of birth and death, starting from the one who is infatuated and then to the one who is attached to religious duties and thereby attached to deities and devatas and heavenly beings and forefathers, to even yogis, all the way up to Brahma, who are going through this cycle in kalpa after kalpa, that is, every cycle of creation, transcending all of them. If you surrender directly unto the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Being situated in the hearts of all beings, then you are eternally freed from the cycle of coming and going, and you are ever one with the Supreme Being. And therefore, Lord Kapila gives this direct instruction to his mother and to all of us that this is the highest path. This is the essence of Bhagavatam too, that don't get caught in sensory pleasures, but don't even get caught in religious merits and all kinds of scriptural ordinances, but simply surrender fully and completely unto the Supreme Lord. So he says, again, as a way of warning, whoever is attached to the world, even if they have great reverence for religious rites, and even if these religious rites are as sanctioned by scriptures, but if they are attached to these religious rites, their understanding gets clouded by passion, they are full of desires, their senses are not in control, and they are worshipping the forefathers. It's called Pitrun Yajanti Anudinam. They are always worshipping the forefathers, the Pitrus, Anudinam, every day, and they are engaged in the pleasures of the home. They are engaged in all these religious activities, including worship of the forefathers, only for living a good household life. They are not devoted to me, but they are devoted to the first three objects of human pursuit, that is, Dharma, Artha, Kama, religious merit, wealth, and pleasure, and therefore they are averse to listening to the stories of Sri Hari. There are many like this who are very perfect in engaging in all the daily duties as ordained by scriptures, the pujas, the worship, going to temple, but they do all of this only with the worldly goal of attaining religious merit and for leading a good family life, but not for totally surrendering unto the Supreme Lord. So they are averse to listening to the stories of Sri Hari because that alone can take away the fear of birth and death, but they are not attached to that. They abandon such stories and they instead engage in petty talks, and they are therefore getting cheated out of the gift of human existence, even if they are engaged in religious duties. And so, what they do, he says, is they perform religious rites all the way. And these are all very practically seen among many Orthodox people, how they engage in religious rites from the from before birth. That is, there are many religious rites given starting from before birth to all the way to after one dies. So all these various religious rites or religious sacrifices they engage in, and they, by doing all this, they ascend to what's called Pitraloka, the realm of the mains, the realm of the forefathers. But then they are eventually born again into the human womb. Very typically such people are born in their own line again. There are many instances, even people talk about how the grandfather comes back as their own child, and there are even examples of such things noticed by people, how there is a child having not just physical resemblance but various memory of a person they have never met before in their own line. So it's said, Lord Kapila says, that such people who are so attached to their own family line, who are constantly engaged in all these activities and do everything apparently perfectly from before birth till death, but they are not surrendered unto me, and therefore they are ascend to the Pitruloka, the realm of the forefathers, and they come back to be born in their own family line, and they have to again go through the same cycle. So this cycle will be endless until they realize the folly of this and surrender unto the Supreme Being. Because he says their merit gets exhausted and they always come back to the world of the mortals. Therefore, again, Lord Kapila concludes, O lady, O mother, worship with all your being the Supreme Lord. It says, as it is said, worship with all thy heart the Supreme Lord, and no one else, nothing else, because he alone is worth adoring. Lord Kapila says, Tasmat tvam sarva bhavena bhajasva parameshtinam. He says sarva bhavena, with all your heart. Tasmat, therefore. So giving all these detailed explanation of what happens to various kinds of people who are all coming back into the cycle of suffering, birth and death. Therefore, to be free of this, with all your heart, worship only the Supreme Lord. Tadguna ashrayaya bhaktya bhajaniya padambujam. वासुदेवे भगवति भक्तियोः प्रयोजितः janayati ashu vairagyam jnanam yad brahma darshanam. So that's how he summarizes it. He says, therefore, O lady, surrender unto Vasudeva in devotion, the Bhagavan Vasudeva. Vasudeva Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojitaha. Through Bhakti Yoga, through the way of devotion, surrender completely unto Vasudeva, who is all there is. And what is the result of that? He says, Janayati Ashu Vairagyam Jnanam Yad Brahma Darshanam, by which instantly comes Vairagya, dispassion, Jnana, wisdom, and Brahma Darshanam, the realization of the Supreme Brahman, the all-pervading truth of the Absolute Being. So he says, therefore, please do not get caught in anything else. It's a instruction out of great compassion to all of us given by Lord Kapila. Do not get caught in anything else except to worship the Supreme Being situated in the hearts of all, Vasudeva, and thereby flowering of dispassion and wisdom and the realization of the Absolute. And then he says, when the mind of such a devotee ceases to perceive any difference, so when one sees this, that everyone is a manifestation of the Supreme Being within and without, then there are no preferences in him. He sees everything as the same, and therefore he realizes the unity of all there is, and naturally he is freed from attachment. That's how dispassion comes instantly, and he is established in the glorious state of the Supreme Being. Because he says the Lord is nothing but absolute consciousness. So, this is again such a beautiful verse that he so precisely summarizes the nature of the Supreme Being and the nature of surrender and realization. He says the Lord is nothing but absolute consciousness and is the same as the transcendent reality, Brahman, the Supreme Spirit, the ruler of all, the Supreme Person. He alone appears in diverse forms as seer, seen, and sight. The trifold, or the what is called as Triputi, the threefold aspects of seer, seen, and seeing, knower, known, and knowing, listener, listened, and listening, all of these, he says, are diverse forms of the Supreme Lord. This verse is again so beautiful. Jnanamatram param brahma paramat ishwarah puman drishyadibih pratak bhavair bhagavan eka iyate. Everything is contained in this one verse. He says, Paramatma Ishvaraha, the Supreme Being, Lord Ishvara, is Jnana Matram. He is pure consciousness, Param Brahma, the Supreme Spirit. Puman, he is the highest person. And then Drishyadibihi Pratak Bhavair, all the various aspects of seer, seen, and seeing, and similarly any subject, object, and activity are only the one Bhagavan. Bhagavan Eka Iyate. The Supreme Bhagavan alone appears as all these various threefold subject, object, and activity, which is the way the world is perceived. So this is the essence of the whole teaching, and therefore he says the true yogi, as opposed to the yogi who is attached to supernatural powers or desiring to ascend to higher realms of being, but the true yogi, the one who is completely surrendered, for him the only desired end is the absence of attachment and realization of the Supreme. This Brahman, the one that is absolute consciousness without any attributes and yet appearing to have all attributes, is what is everything there is. He says it is the Mahat Tattva, the cosmic intelligence. It is the threefold guna, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. It is the gross elements, which are space, air, fire, water, and earth. It is the various senses, and it is what is coming as the ego. And this entire diversity of appearances is all the same Supreme Being, who is all there is, from whom everything has sprung and into whom everything dissolves. Therefore, he says, one who can perceive this as such, whose mind has been composed and rid of all attachment through devotion, such a being is situated in true wisdom, true yoga, true dispassion, and true knowledge. Therefore, he says, summarizing everything, Lord Kapila says, I have taught you, O Mother, the wisdom which reveals the entire nature of the absolute being, by which one can realize the truth of Purusha and Prakriti. So he started with the discriminating wisdom of Purusha and Prakriti, and how Prakriti has all these 24 categories, and yet everything comes out of Purusha, the Supreme Being, who is as time, and brings forth through time all these various attributes or various categories and dissolves it back unto him. And then he spoke about the beauty of associating with the right sages and saints and satsanga in order to bring about devotion to this Purusha, the Supreme Being, and not caught in attachment to Prakriti. And then he spoke in detail about what happens due to attachment to Prakriti, the hellish existence one goes through. And also he gave a warning about those who are apparently religious but still caught in worldly goals. And finally, concluding everything, Lord Kapila has said here that therefore, realizing all this, if you know the discriminating wisdom of Purusha and Prakriti and surrender completely to Purusha, the Supreme Being, then you realize the ultimate. This is the discipline of jnana and this is the discipline of bhakti. He says again, to end all disputes that constantly erupt among people, he says jnana and bhakti are one and the same. Jnana yogascha mannishto nairgunyo bhakti lakshanah dvayor api eka eva artho bhagavan shabda lakshanah. Such a nice verse summarizing everything. He says jnana yogascha, the discipline of jnana, bhakti lakshanah, the discipline of bhakti, dvayorapi, both of them are eka, one alone. And what is the defining quality of that one? He says it is Bhagavan Shabda Lakshana. That one is signified by the word Bhagavan. So Bhagavan, or the Supreme Lord, is that which is the essence of bhakti and jnana, which are one and the same. Devotion and wisdom, which are one and the same. Therefore, that which appears as many, that which seems to have manifold diversity, is all the one Supreme Lord. And so, Lord Kapila says, through devotion, which is the primary fundamental way of surrendering to the Supreme Lord, and through various other activities based on the foundation of devotion, such as engaging in public utility work, that is, to give away one's wealth for right causes, engaging in various sacrifices, austerities, penances, study of the various texts related to self-inquiry, controlling the mind and senses, engaging in yoga, engaging in the eightfold limbs of yoga, which we have already seen, yama, niyama, and so on. All of these can be of help as long as one is situated in the foundation of devotion, the discipline of complete surrender, which brings forth the realization of the self-effulgent Supreme Lord, who is both with form and without form, with attributes and without attributes. He says, Iyate Bhagavan ebihi saguno nirguna swadruk. With and without form, the same Supreme Being appears, and he can be realized through the foundational discipline of surrender and loving devotion, with all the various other activities that are on top of this attitude of service, surrender, and devotion. So then he concludes by saying, I have therefore told you the quality of bhakti yoga. Again, he reminds that there are 4 types of bhakti. We already saw that the 3 modes of gunas, or sattva, rajas, and tamas, create 3 types of bhakti, which are all still partial. The one which is violent and envious and forceful is the bhakti with tamas. The one with desires and passion is bhakti with rajas. The one which is involved in charity and right noble causes, but yet not fully surrendered to the Supreme Being as the only truth, is bhakti with sattva. And the 4th and the highest bhakti is exactly the recognition that Bhagavan alone is, and thereby surrendering unto him totally. So Lord Kapila says, thus there are 4 types of bhakti I have talked to you about. I have talked to you about time, that which kills everyone and everything except the one who is fully surrendered, because he is not associated with Prakriti and therefore he is never in the realm of death. Then he says, I talked to you about the various jivas, that is the various beings, living entities that go through various forms of suffering. And then I finally talked to you about the highest teaching of surrender, which makes the realization of the Supreme Being as the ultimate and the highest purpose of living. So, with this, Lord Kapila concludes, and he says, very importantly, this was said by Krishna too in Bhagavad Gita, that this teaching should not be taught to people who are not suitably ready. So he gives the qualities of such people. Do not preach this gospel to a wicked person, to one who is not humble, to one who is arrogant, to one who is a hypocrite, to one who is attached to sensory pleasures, to one who is attached to various worldly goals. So, such people who are not ready for such teaching should not be forced this teaching. This is an important thing that many people sometimes miss in a missionary zeal, as it were. But Lord Kapila says here, it is also said in many places, it is said not to cast pearls before swines, because swines cannot appreciate pearls and they will trample upon them. So it is not to with such people, what is said is our own being is the best way to give this wisdom. If we simply remain situated in this wisdom, fully surrendered, and not be disturbed by such people, then they can see this and something can awaken in them, but not by verbally telling them, because if we tell them, they may only either get repelled by it or not appreciate it or just discard it. So he says, do not teach this to anyone who is not suitable, but instead he describes the quality of those who ought to be taught this. He says it can be imparted to those who are full of reverence, a devotee, one who is humble, one who is free of envy, who is friendly to all living beings, who takes delight in serving others, who has no taste for sense pleasures, who is serene and who is free from jealousy, who's pure within and without, and above all, who holds me dearer than anything else. So, such are the qualities of those to whom this teaching has to be imparted, he says. Very nice verse too. Shraddhanaya bhaktaya vinitaya anasuyave bhuteshu kritamaitraya sushrushabhirataya cha बहिर्जात विरागाय शांतचित्ताय दीयताम निर्मत्सराय शुचये यस्याहम प्रेयसाम प्रियः. One with Shraddha, one with Bhakti, Vinitaya, one with humility, Anasuyave, one with no envy, Bhuteshu Krita Maitraya, one who is friendly to all beings, Sushrushabhirataya, one who delights in serving others, Bahirjata Viragaya, one who is detached from worldly pleasures, Shantachittaya, serene minded, Nirmatsaraya, free of envy, free of jealousy, Shuchaye, one who is clean, and Yasyaham Prayasam Priyaha, one who holds me dearer than anything else. So, to such people, to such beings who are having this attitude, or at least yearning to cultivate this attitude, to them this teaching ought to be given. And finally, as Phalashruti, Lord Kapila says, one who listens to this with reverence and repeats this discourse with his mind fixed on me, he will certainly attain to my state even by listening once to it. He says, Yayidam Struniyad Amba Shraddhaya Purusha Sakrit Yo Vabhidatte Matchittaha Sahiyeti Padavim Chame. One with great reverence, earnestness, and humility listens to this teaching of Kapila. These are the teachings we have seen of Kapila over the last few chapters, which we have summarized in this chapter. So, Lord Kapila says as conclusion, one who has listened to all these teachings even once with humility and earnestness, he is sure to be free of all suffering and attain my state, or realize my being, realize the Supreme Self. So with this wonderful chapter concludes. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.